Hello, this is Rena Klayman here with Rabbi Russ Resnick for Pastoral Caregiving. We're finishing up our topic of mourning with the mourner, and we will then move on to caregiving during crisis. Next lecture, we will pick up with trauma-informed caregiving. So, although we know grief looks and feels much different from one person to the next and from one situation to the next, there are some models of grief that can help us conceptualize what might be happening within a person's head and heart during a time of grief. So I'm going to cover a couple of models of grief, and you see on the screen that Margaret Strobe and Hank Shute developed the dual process model of bereavement. This model outlines two simultaneous processes of grief. So the first process is grief expressed through loss-oriented activities. This is marked by crying, a feeling of yearning, sadness, denial, anger, dwelling on the grief or the circumstances, isolating oneself. And while the mourner is in the midst of this process, you might see the grieving person exhibit some uncharacteristic intensity of emotion or some reactivity or some behavior changes. At the same time, the grieving person engages in restoration-oriented activities, which facilitate the grieving process. So during this process, the griever makes changes in order to adapt to a new role, establish a new routine, and cultivate a new way of life. And during this process, those close to the griever might experience an uncomfortable adjustment period because of the new role and the new routine the grieving person is trying to adopt. Last lecture, Rabbi Russ covered Worden's tasks of grief very thoroughly, so I am not going to be redundant, but I wanted to bring up these tasks because I have found this model to be the most accurate and the most helpful as I've worked with people who are grieving. I actually find it most helpful to share this model with the grieving person. It's not necessarily appropriate or helpful to share right away, but at an appropriate time, which I would say is usually several months after the actual loss. It can be pretty enlightening for a person who is in the midst of a grieving period to learn about these tasks because it puts words to what they have already been struggling through. It can prompt the griever to do some intentional soul searching and to be proactive about their feelings rather than continuing to allow the grief to sort of, quote unquote, happen to them. And this sense of regaining control can be crucial to ultimate healing. Also, I find this is a good tool to use to sort of coach the grieving person in communicating their experiences to others. Often a person who is grieving is bombarded with questions and concerns from well-meaning friends and family, but responding to those questions and concerns can be overwhelming in the midst of an already overwhelming situation. A person in mourning often doesn't know how to respond, so I encourage those I work with to use the things on this list of tasks as kind of their pat answer for such questions. So if he or she is approached by a concerned coworker, for instance, instead of getting tongue-tied or struggling to search for a way to communicate what's happening, you know, they can say something like, I just am having trouble accepting the reality of it all, or I'm, you know, trying to just let myself experience the pain. They can quickly move on to another subject, or, you know, if they're inclined, they can let their coworker respond and engage in a conversation about the grief.
Rena, I'd like to add a point to this real quickly.
Yeah.
That, you know, last week we showed how Worden's tasks of grief really line up with the pattern we see in Scripture. I use the example of the death of Moses, and then the at the end of Deuteronomy, the beginning of the book of Joshua, that really show the same four tasks or the same stages. And then Dr. Raphael, in his article in the textbook, ties similar, they're not identical, but really very parallel, very much in alignment with these tasks of grief. He ties that into the traditional Jewish mourning process. So the value of that for a lot of individuals is that it really is helpful and comforting to see that what they're experiencing, even though it's individual, there's a framework in Scripture, there's a framework in Jewish tradition that helps them understand what they're going through, helps them to see that they're part of community, part of a bigger picture, even as they're going through the intensely personal time of grief. So I think the tasks of grief can really align with traditional and scriptural sources.
Yeah, I agree. And I agree that that's, sort of an important part of the healing process is, knowing that others have gone before you in this process. So let's move on to the continuing bonds theory, which was developed by Klass, Silverman, and Nickman, and is another model that I use a lot, especially with the adolescents I work with. This model is somewhat radical. It asserts that grief doesn't end with acceptance or, like we saw in Worden's model, reinvesting in a new life. In fact, it asserts that grief doesn't end at all. So it asserts that grief is acknowledging that your relationship with the deceased is different, but not over. The first part of the grief is working out ways to continue your relationship with the deceased. This can be things like writing letters or journal entries, keeping special keepsakes in view, telling stories, recounting memories, continuing to celebrate birthdays and other special events. The second part is incorporating those things into your life so that you can continue bonds with your loved one. So one way I use this model with my adolescents is that I keep a large box in my office. It's just a cardboard like moving box that some of the kids have decorated for me, and it has a split at the top and a sort of a small door cut out at the back, and this is our grief post box. So they use it to quote-unquote mail letters, pictures, school papers, with good grades to their loved one, through the slit in the top, or send bigger packages through the back. And I find that, this is really comforting for them to feel like they're continuing this relationship with the loved one who they've lost. This model rejects the idea that detachment must be a part of grief. And so the concept of grief shifts from a linear process to a pervasive way of life. And the connotation of grief shifts from being sort of heavy and sad to what's hopefully a little more peaceful, nostalgic, and even hopeful. So I find it helpful to describe this concept to the griever once they have reached a state of calmness and stability. And this is usually roughly 1 year or so after the initial loss. And at this point, they may feel a tinge of guilt for beginning to enjoy life again. The griever feels an empty space, but that space is no longer their central focus. And that's a positive step, but the person grieving doesn't necessarily see it as completely positive because they might feel in a way that they're betraying their lost loved one, simply because they're feeling better. So introducing this concept can be an effective way of opening a conversation about how to make meaning out of the loss experience and how to continue the legacy of the lost person while moving on with your own life. So here are some helpful suggestions. Hopefully they're helpful. You know, our society is not empathetic to the griever and does not facilitate a grieving process. Rabbi Russ touched on this a little bit last week. It can be difficult for the grieving person to function as they are expected to. You know, bereavement leave is usually like 2 days or so. After this, the griever is expected to go to work, you know, to get the kids to school, to go on with their lives as usual, kind of, you know, without a hiccup. And it can be hard for the griever to be productive and to function as usual. So in order to maintain function, and this isn't necessarily ideal, but a suggestion that I use that is adaptive to our society's expectation. I suggest a grief appointment. So what this looks like is each day the person grieving will set aside anywhere from, you know, 5 minutes to an hour to grieve. And, you know, I mean, this can just kind of be done really informally by just, you know, sort of sitting and thinking about the person, or it can be more planned. And as a caregiver, that's something that you might be able to help with. You know, you could help the person create a grief box with pictures, letters, keepsakes, things like that to help facilitate the appointment. And so what happens is, outside of the grief appointment, when the person is in a place where they are expected to function as usual, we encourage them to do some self-talk. So they might be at work, or you know, the grief hits them at some inopportune time, and they can say to themselves something like, you know, this is not my grieving time. My grieving time is, you know, in so many hours, and just kind of prompting themselves to set it aside for now. You know, not pushing it away forever, but setting it aside until there's a you know, more socially acceptable time to engage in grieving. One last note that I want to say about children in grief. You know, grief is a part of life that does not and has never surprised God. And we often worry excessively about our children when they are in mourning. Today, in our Western society, it is not acceptable for a person, particularly a child, you know, to have any appearance of heavy-heartedness or to be anything but carefree. And because of this, I often see that parents and other caregivers often are quick to toss their children into counseling or grief groups, thinking that it will cure the mourning process. And I want to encourage you to challenge yourself and your congregants to rethink this and to identify the normalcy as well as the value in the process of grief, even for our children. You know, children intuitively know what they need and when they need it. And a child may mention their loss to a stranger, say at a grocery store, which, you know, might mortify their parent. But what's happening is the child knows that they need a small dose of comfort in that very moment. And this doesn't mean the child is dysfunctional, and it doesn't mean the caregiver needs to even address it with the child later on. The child was, you know, able to identify their need and was capable of getting their own need met at the right time. And it's okay for the, you know, person or whoever's caring for the child to just let that be and, you know, just kind of move on. The greatest factor associated with resiliency is community. So strong and numerous relationships where interaction is positive, physically affectionate, and frequent is the absolute best therapy that you can give to a grieving child. So that is the conclusion of our unit on grief. We are moving on to the topic of crisis, and we will start with a definition of crisis. So one definition of a crisis, which was stated by Richard K. James, is a perception or experiencing of an event or situation as an intolerable difficulty that exceeds the person's current resources and coping mechanisms. James states that unless the person obtains relief, the crisis has the potential to cause severe affective, behavioral, and cognitive malfunctioning. So it's important to recognize and remember that crises are subjective. A crisis to one person could be an upcoming midterm or public speaking engagement, while a crisis to another person is something far more life-altering. The crisis is not actually in the event itself, but in the person's response. Response to the event. There are obviously a number of different types of crises. I've listed some, but again, let's remember that crises are subjective to the person involved. The text covers the issue of disaster pretty thoroughly. These are either natural or human-induced events that involve and affect an entire community, and these crises and the response they require are unique. I encourage you to stay up to date on current events and to be aware of disasters around the globe. It is important to recognize that a disaster that takes place halfway around the world has the potential to affect one or more of your congregants. So don't assume that because something occurred thousands of miles away that it can be ignored. Whether a congregant has loved ones involved in the disaster or the event simply raises some difficult questions and concerns for your congregants, it is important to address disasters and to make yourself available to congregants. Another type of crisis is the crisis of family disruption. There's divorce, there's marriage, which can be a crisis, especially if it's remarriage and a blending of a family. Having loved ones move away can be a crisis. Having loved ones move near to you can be a crisis at times. I think we can all, identify a number of family disruption crises. There are also medical crises, whether it's for yourself or a loved one, mental health crises. This could be the onset of depression or anxiety for you or a loved one, or some form of. You're good, Russ. It's the
okay.
Slides are pretty sparse. So, very rarely, a person experiences like a psychotic break or what we might call a nervous breakdown, and that would be a pretty intense crisis and maybe something that you would face, but again, that's pretty rare. Death, obviously, it can be a crisis, and then crises involving children, and these are all similar to what I have already stated. But I put this in its own category because there is a unique experience of crisis when it involves your child or your children. And this often involves pervasive worry and feelings of inadequacy on the part of a parent. So receiving a frightening medical diagnosis for your child is a unique crisis. Any, sort of mental health diagnosis that you might receive for your child, or even the pressure from teachers or counselors or doctors to diagnose and treat your child's mental health. I see parents enter crisis mode a lot in this situation. And then, and that pretty much across the board has to do with a diagnosis of ADHD in their child. And then there are crises involving your child's behavior. You know, they're acting out frequently, they're making dangerous choices. You know, that certainly puts a parent into crisis mode. So let's talk about how to be effective during a crisis. First, I encourage you to rely on your personal life experience. You know, you may not have experienced what your congregant is experiencing, but we all know what it's like to feel like our life is off kilter, to feel unable to think clearly and make decisions. We have all experienced fear and confusion. The best thing to do is to identify what you would need from a supportive person in the time of your own crisis. And it is important to intentionally place yourself in the position of the person in crisis in order to be most effective. Second, be a godly, non-anxious presence. The person in crisis is having trouble regulating himself or herself. He or she might act erratically. You might notice that they're speaking rapidly. They may seem jittery, unable to be still. Don't succumb to the urge to sort of mimic their erratic or their elevated tempo. Be intentional about regulating yourself. You can do this by monitoring your breathing, you know, keeping it slow and well-paced, being aware of muscle tension and working to alleviate that in yourself. You can engage in silent prayer and worship throughout, you know, your support during the crisis. So set a rhythm for yourself. The person in crisis and all those around you will sense your calm or your anxiety. And when you allow your anxiety level to rise as a result of the anxiety of the person in crisis, then his or her anxiety level will rise even higher. Yours in turn will rise again, and so forth. And so your calm presence may or may not lower the level of anxiety for the person in crisis, but it is likely to prevent it from elevating anymore, which is very valuable. Also, tap into your creativity and be flexible. You will be challenged to make some decisions and to find some solutions. The problems will not be linear, and the answers will not be apparent or simple. So realize there will be no right answer in the midst of the crisis. Think outside the box and try not to be discouraged by roadblocks, and there are likely to be many of those. Keeping calm and being that godly, non-anxious presence is very valuable in tapping into your creativity also. Also, have an adequate reserve of energy. This has to do with self-care that we have covered before. Make sure that you're consistently well-rested and well-nourished and not overworked. Build your own resiliency. So it's important for you in your role as caregiver to have bounce-back capability. Once you get through the current crisis with your congregant, you are still faced with work and family life and your own responsibilities. And, you know, you can't afford to allow another person's crisis, no matter how much you care about them, to disrupt what is important for you. And in order to do this, I encourage you to measure your success in the midst of the crisis by whether or not you were supportive and present with your congregant. You know, resist any temptation to measure success by your congregants' behaviors or choices, or even by your ability to find the right or even an effective solution. You know, compliment yourself for being present and move on to your next responsibility. And again, this requires consistently caring for yourself in all areas, physical, emotional, spiritual, etc. So here are some helpful skills for crisis caregiving. Gather information. So during the crisis, you're going to take time to carefully converse with your congregant in order for you to conceptualize the problem. Whatever the crisis stimulus is, what is putting the person into crisis mode is the problem. Again, remember that a crisis experience is subjective. So use your holistic listening skills that Rabbi Russ covered a few lectures ago. Use those skills to view the crisis from the perspective of your congregant and to identify their needs from their point of view. Use clarifying questions and statements to solicit more explanation or information when necessary. And ask questions and make observations to determine the safety of the congregant, as well as the safety of his or her loved ones or anybody else involved in the crisis. So use your skills covered in the lecture on hot button issues on the topic of suicide. Ask direct questions about the person's ideations and intentions. Ask these in regard to self-harm as well as harm to others. Sometimes a crisis involves a situation of abuse, so I encourage you to ask exhaustive questions about the whereabouts and safety of children and other loved ones, particularly if there are elderly loved ones involved in the situation, just to work toward ensuring everybody's safety. Also, a skill to use during crisis is to provide support. A congregant who you have an excellent relationship and rapport with may forget that in a time of crisis. This congregant may question your care for them. They may question your dedication to them. They may even question your intentions. So it's important not to personalize this. Recognize this is a result of the person in crisis. It's a result of their inability to regulate themselves in the midst of the crisis. So patiently reassure them verbally reassure them with your presence, and reassure them with follow-through that you do value and care for them. And you can, just kind of wait for that time to pass. Once the crisis and their reaction diffuses, they're going to be back to their trusting self. This often takes a supernatural ability to accept and validate a congregant despite their behavior toward us in the midst of the crisis. This is not the time to address anything inappropriate like accusations or, if they're making accusations against you or blaming, it's the time to unconditionally reassure them of your care for them. It's important to hone in on immediate needs. So if there are needs for food, clothing, shelter, warmth, medication, medical care, immediate child care, it's important to hone in on those, because if there are needs beyond those, they cannot be adequately addressed until the basic needs are met. So the next skill we're going to use is to brainstorm. Once you have conceptualized the problem, begin brainstorming ways for the crisis to be alleviated. And if the congregant is in a place where they can help you with this, then certainly do that in collaboration with the congregant. So first, review your resource list for helpful resources. Also review possible situational supports. These are people within the congregant's trusted circle who care for them and who are willing to extend practical and emotional support. Also review with the person in crisis some possible coping mechanisms. These are actions, behaviors, or environmental resources that may help your congregant get through the crisis. So some examples of these might be exercising, being with a friend, hanging out at the synagogue, just kind of being present there, cleaning, playing with children, nurturing children, singing or listening to music, dancing or writing. Those are all excellent coping skills. Experiment with gently encouraging positive yet realistic and productive thinking patterns. If the person in crisis is not in a state where this is possible, then just continue to remain a godly, non-anxious presence. But if the person has calmed and is able to access sort of their complex thinking skills, talk to them through and about the faulty thinking patterns that you might see. So there should be an information sheet posted that outlines some types of faulty thinking that a person in crisis might engage in. So you can review that, and helping the person to identify this faulty thinking and then challenging the thinking can really contribute to alleviating a crisis. And again, that really is only appropriate once the person is calm and able to engage in some critical thinking skills. Lastly, you're going to develop a plan. So if possible, you want to collaborate with the person in crisis to come up with a short-term plan. Lay out some defined action steps and identify something very concrete for the person to do right now. If the person in crisis is not in a state where he or she is able to collaborate, you can give directives, and that might be very comforting to the person if you just kind of, take charge and make the decisions. But it's important to be balanced with this and to be sure to validate the person's control, choice, and autonomy. Also, part of developing a plan is making an agreement with the person in crisis. So whatever state the person in crisis is in, whether they're still in that panicky state or whether they've calmed a bit, be sure the person understands and agrees with the plan. So seek some sort of indication that they do agree to follow through. Be intentional, but not contrived, about communicating empathy, genuineness, and acceptance. These go a very long way for a person in the midst of crisis. And the very best way to communicate these things sincerely is to sincerely feel these things. The person in crisis will sense whether or not you are being authentic. Let's talk about when to make referrals, when that is appropriate. If you observe that a congregant is exhibiting some prolonged traumatic symptoms, or some sort of impairment as a result of the response to their trauma, it's important to refer them to a professional. Rabbi Russ is going to cover this a little more in depth in a little bit, but I'll just give a little intro. So, prolonged distress or impairment can include things like losing a job or a marriage, or significant marriage difficulty, becoming engaged in drug or alcohol abuse, loss of friendships. If a person verbalizes significant distress as a result of their response to a trauma, or if you observe these things in a person, it is important to refer them out to a professional. So some things to look out for and to listen for in your conversations with them are nightmares, flashbacks, or unwanted thoughts of the traumatic event, avoidance of anything that may bring recollections of the trauma. If you notice the person is uncharacteristically detached socially or emotionally, if they're emotionally disengaged, or if they become disinterested in enjoyable activities, these are warning signs. If you become aware of sleep trouble, outbursts of anger, hypervigilance, those are also warning signs. So if these symptoms persist beyond a time reasonable and proportional to the crisis situation, then you know that it's time to refer to a professional. And I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Russ to cover this a little more in depth.
All right. Well, thank you, Rena. We've used the terms crisis and trauma in the last few points of discussion, and the two are related. Trauma. I want to talk a little bit about PTSD, which obviously post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's based on trauma, and I would say that trauma is more of a specific event that can trigger a crisis. Not every crisis has a traumatic event that created it, and not every trauma creates a crisis. You can have a traumatic event and not have a crisis. I would also say that a crisis tends to be more multi-personal. Trauma is something generally that happens to one person. Crisis can involve a number of people. Post-traumatic stress disorder is to be honest, it's a diagnosis that you hear a lot about in recent years, and whenever there's a mental health diagnosis that begins to get a lot of attention, I get a little skeptical, because sometimes these things tend to be overdiagnosed. I remember years ago that the diagnosis of what they used to call multiple personality disorder got a lot of attention. A lot of people were getting diagnosed with it, and I became skeptical about it, whether it was even real or not. I've since been convinced there is such a thing in reality, but also skeptical that it might be over-diagnosed. And I've been a little bit that way with post-traumatic stress disorder, but I've actually found the diagnosis to really be helpful. And I'm going to share a couple of examples from my own practice that I, just as a note, when you share something from your practice, you disguise it so that the person is not recognizable, and that's what I'm going to be doing now with a couple of case history examples. I'm changing a few details, but the heart of it is real. So I was working with a family who had a teenage daughter who was, they described her as kind of a sensitive, unusually sensitive person, but she functioned well, everything was fine, and then she went into a nosedive and ended up being hospitalized, being medicated for a variety of different diagnoses and a variety of different medications. And not only were they not helpful, it seemed like she was getting worse. And finally they opted to visit a physician who had a reputation for being much more conservative with medication, and he took a more thorough history of what this teenage girl had gone through in the past couple of years, came up with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, because this girl's closest friend a year or two before had gone into the hospital for a routine procedure, and there was some medical complication. She died in the hospital before she came out, and really that was the beginning of all of the symptoms that this girl was struggling with. And it was really a case of post-traumatic stress disorder that had been misdiagnosed as bipolar or major depressive episode, and other doctors were trying to medicate it away, which didn't work. So the trauma that we're talking about, again, there's a lot of overlap with what Rena just covered, would be directly experiencing a traumatic event, violence, death, other events that are traumatic, witnessing that event in person that might occur to someone else. I had a client who, as a teenager, witnessed a murder. It was in a park on a picnic, actually, with a girlfriend, and somebody came up to somebody else who was in the park and shot him right in front of this guy. And so he had PTSD from that trauma. Learning about a traumatic event that occurred to a close family member or a close friend, and this has to be something that's a violent, unexpected event that can cause the trauma. Experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to details of the traumatic event. First responders can suffer from PTSD, police officers repeatedly exposed to details of child abuse or violence, that type of thing. So those are the kinds of events that we would call trauma that can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And there's the result of that is having what they call intrusion symptoms, that memories, emotional reenactment, flashbacks of those events are happening and out of the control of the person. Another symptom of PTSD is the avoidance of stimuli associated with the traumatic event, either avoidance of or efforts to avoid the memories, the thoughts, the feelings about the event, or trying to avoid external reminders that arouse the memories, the thoughts, the feelings about the event. There's negative changes in mood or in cognition, and a lot of this that I'm listing is from the DSM Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that is used in the psychiatric and psychological world. Other symptoms would be an inability to remember an important aspect of the event, or a persistent and exaggerated negative belief or expectation about oneself or others. In my beginning years in counseling, I worked at a Christian drug rehab program, residential program, and about half of our clients there were ex-offenders who had been assigned to this program as a condition of their parole. And so a lot of ex-offenders have PTSD just from the experience of being in prison, and the things that happen to an inmate or the things that they witness are traumatic, and they have PTSD. They have symptoms. They reliving or triggering memories of that event. So I remember, and this was long before the diagnosis of PTSD was that well known, that as I said, it was a residential program, and so we had like a dining area that was, we made it nice, it was pleasant, but it wasn't all that different from at least the physical surroundings they were used to in the prison. And one time I decided, as kind of a special treat, to take a few of we called them students, to take a few of our students out to dinner at a restaurant, as a special outing. And we got to the restaurant, and a few of the guys froze at the entry into the restaurant, and what they said outwardly, they said, "We don't know what to do. We don't know how to behave in this setting. It's not institutional enough." And I thought of it and those, at that time, I thought it was just they weren't familiar with the social setting, which I think was true, but I think was also, at least in some cases, was PTSD, that they, when you're in prison, when you're in the cafeteria, you know, you have a ritual, you have a routine that keeps you safe, you're on guard all the time, you're sitting in certain places to be safe, to avoid attack, and being exposed to this unfamiliar setting triggered a lot of the anxiety. It wasn't just that they were a little nervous about going into this place, but some of the guys were literally glued to the threshold of the door. They couldn't go in. And I think it was a PTSD symptom. Sometimes there's distorted beliefs or perceptions about the cause or the consequence of the trauma, so that the individual blames himself or herself for it. There's a persistent negative emotional state, just a sense of dread, guilt, shame, diminished interest or participation in significant activities, and so on. And then final set of symptoms would be hypervigilance, irritability, exaggerated startle response. And really, to sum it up, I think everybody's familiar with the fight or flight response to danger. It's actually fight or flight, flight or fight or freeze would be the response. And PTSD is often entails being stuck in that kind of response, or triggered into that kind of response very readily, very easily, and having to live with it. And that's physiologically, it's just very damaging. It's bad for the system. It's bad for brain function when that fight or flight syndrome is sustained. So what about caring for PTSD? Now, this is interesting that studies have shown, you know, there's a few different approaches that seem to be effective in caring for PTSD, but studies have not been able to determine which one is the most effective. They all are effective within a broader setting, and I'll show you what I mean by that. The reason I'm telling you this is partly for referral. I don't know if you will be actually providing treatment for PTSD, but it's good to know what it is when you refer, and what to look for when you do referral. But also, as pastoral caregivers, we might be part of the overall response to PTSD. So the first step, or first component in an effectively caring for PTSD, is the therapeutic relationship itself. And that's really true across the board, that before we try to help or provide therapy or even refer, that we establish a therapeutic relationship ourselves with the person, that we recognize that there really is a disorder here, there really was genuine trauma, that the symptoms, the things they're struggling with are not weird or out of the blue, that they're a response, an adaptation to trauma. In fact, I think we mentioned it last week that some practitioners don't like to call it post-traumatic stress disorder. They like to call it post-traumatic stress adjustment or post-traumatic stress adaptation. And the therapeutic relationship is helping the person to see that the trauma is real, their response is understandable, they're still obviously fully human, created in God's image, worthy of dignity and respect, and we're going to relate to them that way. And the second component is self-regulation, relaxation. It's really related to crisis too, that before we try to solve problems, the first step is, well, to build a relationship. Second is to help help the person to be safe, to learn to self-regulate and relax. In PTSD, we're talking about using relaxation techniques. I think as followers of Yeshua, we get a little nervous about this sometimes because some of these things have been co-opted by the New Age approach or by Eastern religions, but I think they're legitimate. Deep breathing, helping people to physically relax, to breathe deeply, to do muscle relaxation. Again, it doesn't have to be anything fancy. You may be referring this person for more intensive help, but as a pastoral caregiver, this is a stage to help the person to, in a sense, to detach from the anxiety and the trauma and to find at least moments of calm. And obviously, the great resource for this is prayer, meditation on Scripture, really slowing down and absorbing. I mentioned the class I attended recently on trauma, and the presenter talked about in contrast with fight or flight reaction of the central nervous system, she talked about the rest and digest response that in a way is the alternative to fight or flight, is rest and digest, not necessarily digesting food, but in our case, digesting Scripture, digesting the food of the Word of God. This can be very powerful in self-regulation and relaxation. We haven't solved the problem yet, but we've created a moment of peace and relief. And then we're ready to address solving the problem. Now, again, this is where you may refer out. There are several techniques for PTSD that are helpful and that are a couple of them I think really relate to our work as pastoral caregivers. One approach is cognitive restructuring or cognitive behavioral type of therapy. There's this very specific approach called CBT, cognitive behavioral. I'm not talking about that specifically, but the whole approach of addressing how we think about, how we perceive what we've gone through. As Rena mentioned, in crisis, it's not the event itself that causes the crisis, but it's the perception or the experience of the event. And we can, from a biblical standpoint, we can provide a different way of perceiving, a biblically informed way of perceiving and of structuring that event. And that turns out to be very closely related to an effective treatment for PTSD. Another treatment is systematic desensitization. So that's a long phrase. I had trouble even saying it. What that means is beginning to expose oneself to the source or to the trigger of the trauma, to acclimate to it, to, in a sense, take the power, the sting out of it. So I mentioned my work with ex-offenders and ex-inmates. And I remember one guy who had some very traumatic experiences in prison that made it very difficult for him to be around other people at all, but especially people in close proximity. And he didn't drive, didn't have a car, so he was dependent on public transportation to get around, and that was a really tough thing for this guy. If he was in a bus and it was mostly empty, he was fine, but as it began to fill up, his anxiety level would begin to mount, and if somebody sat next to him, it would mount unbearably, and he would just get off. He'd go, get off the bus at the next stop, and then just try for another bus that might be less crowded. And so I challenged him with the idea of extending the amount of time he would stay on that bus as after he began to get really uptight. I said, I'm not telling you got to make the whole trip, but see if you can stay on for an extra stop or two. And with the idea of building that up, of revisiting that scene of trauma, because just the tight, crowded conditions brought back memories of prison. And so the idea is to take the power, the sting of that memory, that triggering event, away by systematically desensitizing to it. And he worked on it some, and then just felt like his coping mechanism of getting off the bus when he got too uptight was actually adequate for him and didn't really need to change. But it gives you an idea of some of the therapy. Oh, well, one reason I wanted to mention that was that I think I got into that stage too quickly with this client. I think that I hadn't built enough therapeutic relationship. I hadn't worked enough with him on self-regulation and relaxation before trying to resolve the problem. And then finally, in PTSD, coming out toward the end of treatment is cognitive restructuring or reconsolidation. So in treatment, and again, this is just for awareness. You're not necessarily going to do this yourself. You may be referring, but just for awareness and caring for PTSD, stage 1 is relationship building. Stage 2, psychoeducation and self-regulation. This is, as I mentioned, techniques of breathing, of cognitive, meditating on scripture, for example, just taking control physically, but it's also learning. It's helping the client to see that what they're dealing with is a real disorder or a real adaptation to trauma. I mentioned the teenage girl. It was tremendously helpful for her to realize that a lot of her symptoms had been stirred up by this traumatic loss of her friend, that she wasn't going crazy, but she was responding to trauma. And then we get to stage 3, recovery resolution, the techniques, the methods of addressing PTSD. And then stage 4 is post-traumatic growth and resiliency building, learning to move on past the trauma, to engage in practices, beliefs that are hopeful, that are flexible and adaptable, and moving into the future. So I believe Rena is going to be covering more on trauma in our next lecture, which originally was scheduled for this session, but we've spread it out a little bit because there was so much to cover in the area of grief that we wanted to deal with. So Rena, I'll hand it back to you. I think we're about near the end of this session.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was great, Russ. I want to point out, you can see from everything that Rabbi Russ covered, PTSD is very complex, and treatment is pretty involved, and it becomes even more complex when there is trauma on top of trauma. And that's something that, excuse me, we will talk about next time with trauma-informed caregiving. And then the other thing I think that's important for you as caregivers to be aware of is secondary trauma, kind of trauma experience through the experience of others, and that's something else that we'll cover next time. So another time to refer your congregant out is if you have sort of assessed lethality. So like we talked about, ask specific questions about suicidal ideation, homicidal ideation, any ideation to harm another person, and ask questions about current safety of loved ones. If there is life-threatening danger, or if there is immediate danger, then that's the time to call the police, to make a trip to the emergency room, or to call a crisis hotline. So before we end, I want to point out that you probably noticed that the readings posted for the text don't necessarily line up with our lectures, and we don't want anybody to be confused by that. We, just kind of wanted to cover a broad number of topics. Hopefully this gives some insight to you on your role as a caregiver in crisis situations. Discussion questions should be posted, and Rabbi Russ, if you don't have anything else, then we can go ahead and sign off.
All right. Well, thank you, Rena. That was a great lecture, and thank you, students. We will check back next week.